Welcome to this online lesson on London in the Second World War. Living through the Blitz. Eyewitness testimony as evidence. The aims today are to interpret sources, to compare sources, and to evaluate eyewitness testimony as evidence of the Blitz. We'll also be briefly looking at a case study of a disaster that happened during the Blitz. First of all, let's turn our attention to this photograph. This picture shows a family in an Anderson shelter. The picture was posed by the government. The big hint is the fact that the front of the Anderson shelter is missing, which wouldn't make it very safe. Firstly, what might be the purpose of this photo? Secondly, in what ways might this posed photo still be useful to historians? It's no good just saying that it's useless because it's been posed and it's not real. Pause the video now while you attempt that, and then press play when you're ready to carry on. Okay, what did we come up with? Well, first of all, the purpose of this photo is likely to be to reassure people. Notice how many people appear to be reasonably comfortably fitting into this Anderson shelter. We've got 2 kids at the back, 2 adults, another adult downstairs, and 2 more children. Count them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people into one small Anderson shelter, and they don't look too cramped. How realistic this would be is another matter. In what ways might a posed photo still be quite useful to historians? Well, here it's useful to remember the purpose of photographs. Clearly, the government was worried that people weren't going to use the Anderson shelters because they seemed so uncomfortable. This was designed to reassure people that they were functional, they were useful, and to say that you could be comfortable inside an Anderson shelter. Of course, this one isn't flooded under a load of rainwater, which probably helps. Let's move on and consider some eyewitness testimony of the Blitz. This woman is Barbara Nixon in her Civil Defence ARP uniform. Very smart she looks too. What we're going to do is we're going to read 2 sources. You'll read both, and then you'll make detailed notes about A, the conditions in the shelters, B, the morale of the Londoners, in other words, in terms of their happiness, and C, the duties of the ARP wardens. You're then going to suggest what might be the A, strengths, and B, weaknesses of using these personal accounts as sources of information. As the sources will be appearing on the screen one at a time, I suggest that you make a note of these tasks now, or otherwise take a screenshot of this screen so you can refer to it while studying the sources. What would be ideal as well is taking a screenshot of the sources of themselves and perhaps printing them so you can have a go at annotating them. Nevertheless, I'll be displaying the sources on the screen in a moment. So pause the video now while you're noting down anything that you need to, and then we'll proceed on to source A. Ready? Let's go. I said source A, I meant source E. From an account of September the 7th, 1940. Okay, before we go any further, note down that date. September the 7th, 1940 is an incredibly important date. It is the first determined and large-scale attack on London during the Blitz. It says the first night of the Blitz, but actually Black Saturday began during the day. This is an account by Barbara Nixon, who was an ARP warden in central London. It was published in 1943. That's right, roughly 3 years after the events described. At 4:43 p.m, the sirens wailed and the population trooped to the shelters. Nobody was seriously frightened. Something might possibly happen this time, but probably not. It was the East End that was getting it. Presently we saw a white cloud rising. A fire engine went up by the main road. There could not ever in history have been such a gigantic fire. Another fire engine raced by. Nearly every fire appliance in London was heading east. We were only 4 miles from this horror, but we had no conception of what it was like. When the all clear sounded at 6:15 p.m, people left the shelters saying, "About time too." We sensed that the real air raids had begun, but we did not yet have the full measure of the coming Blitz. I had not grasped the principle that an important part of the incendiary raids was to provide a beacon for later bombing. I was annoyed when the siren sounded again. Okay, take a moment to complete your tasks based upon source E. Pause the video while you do so. Okay, hopefully you've managed to identify everything in there. One of the crucial things about this source is the morale issue. At this stage, morale seems pretty high, and actually people seem quite blasé about it. They're not expecting to be bombed at all. Let's see how that changes as the night wears on. Let's have a look at source H now. Barbara Nixon continues. This is taken from the same original source material as source E. Now before you panic, sources in the exam will be much shorter than this, but this is worth having a look in full. If you're unable to read the text, just ensure that your video is playing in high definition, and remember to pause it when all the text is displayed. When the siren started again, Barbara went to her post. The whole sky to the east was blazing red. It seemed as though half of London was burning, and 50,000 firemen would not be able to put out a fire of that size. In Shaftesbury Avenue, 5 miles from the blaze, it was possible to read the evening paper. With a whine and a crash somewhere near, a bomb fell and the pavement trembled. It was the first time that I had heard a bomb, and in that instant I realised that the whole of London was a target area, and any street might get its share. When we got back, we visited the shelters. They had been apprehensive before. Now they were distinctly nervous, although few showed real fright. A warden from the next sector arrived back from his work in the East End. He insisted on going into each shelter and told them of the gigantic fire 5 miles of them, and the damage, and the casualties, and the blood, and the horrors. By 10 p.m. the shelterers were growing exasperated. By midnight they were frightened. Very few of them had imagined what they would have to sit into the shelter for more than an hour or more. Neither, for that matter, had the authorities, who had not brought rags or blankets or provisions. Some even had no coats, as it had been a warm evening. The wooden benches around the walls were packed, and the remainder had to stand or sit on bits of newspaper on the concrete floor. The overcrowding was appalling, and the air stank. It had not before occurred to me that a warden would be expected to not just poke his head round the door and make sure everyone was all right, but to chat to one and all and try and cheer them up. By 3 a.m. the raid was heavier than ever, and bombs were much closer. They came down with a tearing sound as well as a whistle. Planes began to circle steadily and monotonously overhead. It was alarming to feel that this time it was we who were the target. I was alarmed. One hadn't got a chance. For half an hour the bombs pounded down all around us. As one struck, another started its downward journey. Neighbouring sectors were hit. Ours was unscathed. 3 streets away a trench shelter was wrecked, but by a miracle only 1 man was killed. At dawn the all clear went, and groups of pale, jaded people trailed back to their homes to snatch a cup of tea before leaving for work. They were cold and exhausted and subdued. "Do you think we'll get another tonight, miss?" they asked. It was as well that they did not know that they were going to get another for 53 nights on end. That day London had changed. It was not only the damage. At last people realised that there was a serious war on. A war that meant death and destruction. And they did not like this realisation. Okay, pause the video and make any notes or annotations that you need to about this source. It's very detailed, so ensure that you spend particular time on this and perhaps do it a paragraph at a time. Pause the video now. These are quite useful sources from Barbara Nixon. They're very detailed, but we must consider the fact that they were written in 1943, 3 years after the event. In all likelihood, this meant that Barbara Nixon was probably able to be a bit more honest than she would have been able to be in 1940. After all, the government would have been worried about causing people panic in 1940, whereas by 1943, the war had changed. Things were going better for the British and their allies, but not only that, most Londoners would have known exactly what was going on during the Blitz, and so these details would not have been shocking to them, nor would they have been unnerving. Consider the duties that she and her other area wardens did. Consider how the morale of Londoners changes throughout the night. Okay, let's move on. Adding in another perspective. The sources we're going to have a look at now are also related to Black Saturday. That's the 7th of September 1940. Make sure you've noted down that date if you haven't done so already. One way of judging the reliability of a source is where the information is backed up by another source. Where this happens, the sources corroborate each other. In other words, they show supporting information. Task: define corroborate. Then read source G and complete the following question. Do a COP of source G. That means content, own knowledge and purpose. What can you find in source G to confirm something in sources E and H? These are the Barbara Nixon sources that we've read before. And 6. From the examples we've studied, and from the official government sources we've studied, What are A, the strengths, and B, the weaknesses of eyewitness accounts compared to official accounts in learning about the Blitz? Now, this is challenging stuff and it may require you to flick back through the video a couple of times, but do give it some proper time. Around 20 minutes would probably be just about enough. Here's source G. From an account of Black Saturday, again that's the 7th of September 1940, by Alan Hutt, a journalist working near London Bridge on a communist newspaper. It was written in his diary. As dusk fell about 9 o'clock, the sight from our roof was incredible. A gold and grey smoke-canopied flaming glow stretching thickly as far as one could see. Blackout was dead for the rest of the night, and bombers came back by the light of the fire to blast the East End. David, a friend, has got a magnificent shot of the fire from London Bridge, but the censor refuses to pass any pictures. Nothing that will confirm the enemy's actions. Okay, pause the video now and complete tasks 4, 5 and 6. Right, let's see what we've got. In terms of the content, we should have identified the description of the fire and the smoke, and also the realisation that the bombers were going to be guided by that light, and also that the government had banned the photograph of the fire. What can we find in source G to confirm the other sources? Well, Barbara Nixon mentions one of the air raid wardens coming in and describing a tremendous fire. She also makes the assertion that 50,000 firemen wouldn't be able to put that out, and bear in mind that London did not have anything like 50,000 firemen. Also, Barbara Nixon says in source E that the fires were a crucial way that the Germans would find London again. She describes them as acting like a beacon. This is another claim that's repeated in source G. From the official government sources we've studied, what are the strengths and weaknesses of eyewitness accounts? Well, the strengths are that people were actually there and they were describing things that they had experienced themselves. However, one of the crucial weaknesses of the accounts are that they only give a singular perspective unless they mention other people's perspectives or a wider picture. However, these original eyewitness accounts, assuming that they have survived, they are often not censored in the same way that official government accounts are, and that does make them extra useful as well. Note that in source G it mentions the censor refusing to pass any pictures that will confirm the enemy's claims. Also, this was about maintaining the sense of calm that people might have and preventing the spread of panic. We're now going to compare two more sources together, so when you're ready we'll move on. Another comparison. Have a look at this photograph. This photo, which we'll call source F, may be David's photo as mentioned in source G. If not, it will be one very like it, and was certainly taken from Tower Bridge on Black Saturday, looking east along the Thames to the Tower of London, Tower Bridge, and the fires to the East End that were started on Black Saturday. Very similar to many of the descriptions that you can find in source G too. Question 7. How does source F corroborate source G? Study both sources, identify key parts, and say how they show similar information. Remember that to corroborate means to back up, so we're not looking for differences here, we're looking for similarities. Pause the video now while you complete that. Okay, what have we come up with? Often a good approach for this sort of question is to identify a quote from one source and then find something that's similar in the other. Remember, sources in the exam paper you are quite entitled to draw circles around, underline, highlight and otherwise annotate. I'm going to choose a quote now. A golden grey smoke canopied flaming glow stretching as thickly as far as one could see. Well, let's see if source F corroborates that. Well, quite obviously it does. So remember, choosing similar examples between different types of sources needn't be too difficult. How do we know that they're the same? Well, let's remember, source G is an account of Black Saturday, which was on September the 7th of 1940, and source F was taken on the 8th of September 1940, presumably therefore the morning after. So we can trust these sources to be produced at roughly the same time. It's as simple as that, really. We're going to move on now to a case study. Sincerity and censorship. Keyword, censorship, where somebody, often the government or other official body, removes or covers up facts. 1. How might 1940s diaries be sincere or honest? Secondly, what purpose might censorship serve for the UK government in World War II? And thirdly, it is always wrong to censor or cover up the facts. Give one way that you agree with this statement and one way that you disagree. Pause the video while you tackle these things. Okay, first of all, 1940s diaries might be sincere because they were often kept private. People were not expecting them to be read, and so therefore they could be perfectly honest in them. Where this is different is if it's the diary of an important person. Important people usually realise that they're quite important and realise that historians might end up reading their diaries after they're dead and gone. That can affect their reliability and sincerity, but the diary of an ordinary person can usually be considered to be quite sincere. What purpose might censorship serve for the UK government? Well, a couple of things really. First of all, it would help prevent panic when things had gone wrong. Might help protect their reputation and their record and their actions as a government. And also it might be used to prevent vital information getting to the enemy. Lastly, it is always wrong to censor or cover up the facts. Well, one way that you might agree with this is that in a democracy it is really important that a government is honest with its people, so any suppression of the truth should be seen as quite scandalous. On the other hand, the war was a remarkable time. If certain information was given out that would be of direct aid to the Germans, it might end up harming the people in the country more than it ended up helping them. So a balance had to be struck. Take for example the photograph down the bottom. This is an example of a letter that was written by somebody to someone in Birmingham to someone else probably in London. Notice that the letter had been randomly selected for examination and censorship, had found not to pass the censorship rules and had been returned to sender. Not every letter in the United Kingdom could be censored, but everyone knew that their letter might be censored, which was designed to prevent people from giving away state secrets. Here's an example of something that was covered up. Have a look at these photographs. The top left photograph shows the remains of South Hallsville School. What makes this photograph particularly vivid is when you realise that building hasn't just disappeared, it has fallen into a basement. That's why the building appears so level to the ground. The whole building has simply collapsed on top of itself and into the basement. Tragically, this school was absolutely filled with refugees, and we're going to find out a little bit more about what happened to them. The bottom right photograph shows the type of weapon that was involved. This is an unexploded version of it. It's called a parachute mine. Originally, these were sea mines that the Germans would lay into harbours and things by aircraft that were designed for blowing up ships. So they were very highly explosive. They had only a thin casing, a very high explosive content, and they descended on a parachute so that they would explode the moment they came into contact with the roof. A case of censorship. Was the government honest with people in World War II? Well, the answer to that is sometimes. The accounts by Barbara Nixon were widely published, but 3 years after the event. But how about this example? On the 10th of September, this is 3 days after the Blitz began, some of the 16,000 people who had been made homeless by the first nights of the Blitz were temporarily housed in South Hallsville School. Their transport to move them to safety had arrived too late. There had been some suggestion that these buses had been sent to the wrong school in a posher area of town, which had added a certain extra sort of scandal to this. A parachute mine landed on the school, causing the basement to collapse, with part of the school falling into the 20-foot crater. 77 people were killed in the official report. Modern estimates, 600 dead. This might be the most deadly single incident of the entire Blitz. And we've only got modern estimates to go on by looking at the census records for various areas of London for people who were evacuated there and looking at when these people died. It does seem much more likely that 77 people killed, which would have been bad enough, is actually a massive underestimation of what the true figure was. Firstly, why would Barbara Nixon's accounts have taken 3 years to publish? Secondly, why would the government cover up the South Hallsville school disaster? And thirdly, as a challenge, do you think, under the circumstances, the government were right to cover it up? If you want to learn a little bit more about the South Hallsville school disaster, I've included a link to a video. It's an hour long, but is a fascinating and detailed look at what happened at South Hallsville and why so many people ended up there. Part of it is even down to an unexploded bomb that landed on a particular street and evacuated people to the school. So do watch that if you want to extend your learning on this, because it'd be really helpful to you. But for now, pause the video and attempt those 3 questions. Press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, so Barbara Nixon's accounts probably took about 3 years to publish because by that point it wasn't going to provide any up-to-date information to the Germans to confirm the effectiveness of their bombing. Why did the government cover up South Hallsville School? Well, let's consider a couple of things. First of all, the news that 600 people had died in one event would be absolutely terrifying to anyone who was entering a similar circumstance. But there's probably a slightly more cynical reason here as well. Note that the transport to save these people had arrived too late. That's a government mess-up. If the government owned that particular mistake, then people would lose focus and lose faith in them. So under the circumstances, were the government right to cover that up? Well, only you can answer that, and only you can confirm your opinion. Personally, for me, I can understand why they did. However, should they have covered it up for so long? Probably not. After the war, perhaps it would have been better to be honest with the people. And on that note, we'll conclude the video there. Like this video if it's been useful to you, and I hope that you'll subscribe to the channel too. Thanks very much for watching.